Welcome to the Conservative Edge. I'm Dr. Joe Khoury, your host. Today we have an unusual twist on the show. I asked my colleague here, Professor Weilborg, to actually coordinate a discussion we're going to have on the economics in Lebanon, specifically on the currency system that we think Lebanon should adopt. Professor Weilborg is an endowed shareholder at Chapman University. He has a doctorate in economics from Princeton University and has been a long-term friend and a strong friend, I believe, of Lebanon. So therefore, without further ado, Professor Weilborg.
Thank you, Dr. Khoury. It's a pleasure for me to guest host this part of the Conservative Edge, where we will focus on Lebanon. As most of you know, Lebanon was a very successful country in the Middle East and the economic, financial, and cultural center. And to some extent, when it comes to economic and cultural progress, it's still on the leading edge. However, we have also read in the newspapers about the current situation, which we could call a Lebanese tragedy, which it really is. And we're going to highlight today some aspects of this tragedy and some crucial reforms that must be made in order to improve the situation over there, economically and in the longer term politically as well. So we're going to start with Dr. Khoury. For those of you who don't know Dr. Khoury fully, even though you have been following his show, I want to say that he holds a doctorate from Wharton School in Pennsylvania. He served as a full professor at the University of California at Riverside for 27 years. He's the author of 25 books, numerous articles, and has been involved in speaking engagement all around the world. To central bankers, to business, to governments. His most recent book is an analysis of the crisis in Lebanon, Lebanon at the brink. And this is where he also presents his proposal for dollarization, which we'll talk about today. And to highlight the issue of dollarization more, we're going to have Dr. Steve Hanke as a guest. He is the world's leading expert on dollarization and currency reform in a hyperinflation country. He's a professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University and a senior fellow and director of the Troubled Currencies Project at the Cato Institute. He has been an architect of every new currency board that has been installed and the architect of two of the three world dollarization reforms that have been implemented in Ecuador and El Salvador. And so we are very happy to have him here. He was the first to identify the Lebanese hyperinflation as the 62nd entry into the Hanke Cruz World Hyperinflation Table in July of this year. So we are very happy to have Dr. Hanke here and Dr. Khoury as outstanding experts in the area. And I'm going to start with Dr. Khoury and ask him a very brief background on the current crisis and why dollarization is or currency reform more generally, is such an important and primary aspect that has to be solved at the foundation of the crisis.
Well, thank you, Klaus. I appreciate your membership of this elite group, I will call it. The three of us have been studying currency systems all over the world, and we have written about it, and no one has written more than Professor Hanke. We are delighted to have you here, Professor Hanke. I'm going to start basically by describing the general nature of the problem in Lebanon. Basically, we created a system of a peg rate. Basically, for the last, say, 30 years, since 1990, that is, we basically said the central bank is perfectly capable of pegging the currency at 1,507 to $1. And everybody was using them interchangeably. Almost every store in Lebanon would accept dollars or Lebanese pound or or exchange dollars for pound or pound for dollars. And currency traders everywhere were taking this as for granted. But the system that was set up, the PEG system, was only possible because all the dollars that really come into Lebanon, they come for foreign direct investment, they come as remittances from Lebanese all over the world, some of them from little portion from me, and so on and so forth. The point here is the banks were really pretty much in control of what the central bank is doing. The banks receive dollars, say, from overseas, no matter the mechanism, and suddenly the central bank needs those dollars in order to defend the Lebanese pound. And that defense of the Lebanese pound proved to be extremely costly. And what I mean by that is the banks give you, say, 5-6%, while other banks in the world are giving you 2 or 3%, and some banks, like the banks in Japan, were giving you negative interest rate. The reason they do that is because I could take the bank, the money, the dollars, that will be ultimately used to defend the Lebanese pound, and they put them with the central bank. The central bank gives them somewhere between 8 and 10%, sometimes over 10%. And banks were doing well. And any additional amount of dollars that come in, they give it to basically they buy government bonds, which had very lucrative rate. Last time I checked, the rate on some of these bonds was 14.7%. Are you kidding me? So basically, the banking license, as I'm sure you know, Professor Hankey, the banking license became a license basically to flow money to the central bank and to the federal government instead of risk assessment, maturity transformation, and all of that stuff that helps the economy. In other words, it makes loan to the people out there who need those loans. As a consequence, things began to happen that were not favorable to this kind of an environment. Leading amongst them is the twin deficit, as I'm sure you know. The first one was the deficit in the government budget, huge. And the second one was the deficit in the balance of payments, huge. So between those two, we have about $33 billion. And they used to be covered by inflows from overseas. Mostly these inflows come from remittances, number one, some foreign direct investment, and ODA support for Lebanon, about $1.5 billion. Suddenly, the remittances are almost gone. They are down to $5 billion. So basically, all of the inflows are about $8 billion. The deficits are about $33 billion. Where do you get the $25 billion? Well, they used to borrow them whenever they needed to, but at this level, they cannot borrow anymore. Lebanon almost has about $100 billion in deficit. What do we do now? My suggestion is to take the central bank, Professor Hankey, out of the business of monetary policy and exchange policy. And because of that, I decided that the best answer is dollarization. And I'm sure you'll explain to us the mechanism of dollarizing a country. It'll be very important for our audience. And to understand, is the process automatic? All you have to do is declare you are on the dollar, or does it require negotiation between the Lebanese government and the Federal Reserve? But with that, I stop, and I'll let you maybe explain to us the alternative system, which is currency board.
Yeah, Dr. Hankey, do you agree with the general description of the current crisis, or something you want to add to it?
I think let me just say that I'll use the informal form. So since I know both of you so well, it's hard for me to refer to you as professors or doctors. So Sarkis was very clear on the fundamental problem, and I agree that one solution is dollarization. And that is a solution because many people in Lebanon are confused because of the pegged rate that they've had at 1,500 to the US dollar for so many years. Now that actually has two aspects to policy. One, the central bank had an exchange rate policy. It was pegged at 1,500. They also had a discretionary monetary policy. And if you have those two, you have a problem because they invariably get tangled up and become contradictory, and the pegs blow out. It was amazing how long the peg held in Lebanon, and one reason you had so many remittances flowing in, it kept the Band-Aid on the thing for a lot longer. Most pegs blow up much more rapidly. They always blow up, always. There are no pegs that are sustainable. And the reason why you can't have an exchange rate policy and a monetary policy at the same time. And there's one way to eliminate that potential conflict, and Sarkis put his finger on it. You dollarize. Then you have an exchange rate policy, but you don't have a monetary policy. The other way to do this is it's a cousin of dollarization, and that's called a currency board system. They're twins, basically. And with a currency board system, you would keep the Lebanese pound. You would announce that you were going to have a currency board, and the currency board would have an exchange rate policy. The exchange rate for the Lebanese pound would be fixed, not pegged. It would be fixed to the US dollar. It would trade freely and be freely convertible. It would be credible because the requirement of a currency board is that you have to have reserves equal to 100% of the value of the local domestic money. In this case, it would be Lebanese pounds that were being issued. So in that sense, the Lebanese pound would become a clone of the US dollar. It would be the same as the US dollar, because if you didn't like your Lebanese pound, you would take it into the currency board, you would exchange it at the fixed exchange rate for the US dollar, and you would always be able to get US dollars because you'd have 100% backing of the thing. So either one of those systems is a solution.
Dr. Hanke, can I ask you one question there?
Yeah,
I mean, essentially, these are both the currency board and dollarization is essentially to replacing the Lebanese currency with the dollar as the foundation. Now, let me ask you: many other countries that have had a currency crisis have simply said, "Well, let the exchange rate float." Thereby, a free float will also essentially create a disconnect between the monetary policy and exchange rate policy. Why is the float not a good alternative for Lebanon to choose?
Okay, Klaus, this is a good point that you're raising, and by the way, the floating rate is, shall we say, the preferred thing in the profession. Most people that's their knee-jerk reaction. They say, "Oh, to fix the crisis and get rid of this conflict between exchange rate policy and monetary policy, you float, because if you have a floating exchange rate, you have no exchange rate policy. The exchange rate's freely floating, so the central bank has no exchange rate policy. They only have a monetary policy." The problem in most of these emerging market countries is that the monetary policies are terrible, and the float doesn't, the floating rate doesn't float on a sea of tranquility. It sinks like a stone, and is very volatile. And as a result, what you end up with usually is a tremendous amount of inflation, and then a big debt crisis, because what happens, the exchange rate sinks, and you have borrowed a lot of money in US dollars or euros or yen or some foreign currency, and what it amounts to is the pile of debt is growing and growing and growing because your domestic currency is sinking in terms of its purchasing power, and you need more and more domestic money to be able to pay off your debt that you've incurred in US dollars or euros or something else. So you get in a debt trap with floating exchange rates, among other reasons. In short,
So essentially,
why,
the dollarization locks in both monetary policy and exchange rate policy, while monetary policy would still be able to be, say, mishandled with a flexible exchange rate.
yeah,
And the dollarization resolves that.
it usually is. If I've looked at every country that's not, now we have about 15 countries that have currency boards. Of course, the most famous one is Hong Kong. It's the biggest one. We have 33 countries that are dollarized, they use a foreign currency rather than a local currency. So we call that generically dollarization, even though in places, by the way, Klaus, you said when you introduced me, I'd done Ecuador's dollarization and El Salvador's. Well, I did Ecuador, but not El Salvador. The second one is Montenegro in 1999. And that, see, generically is dollarized because in 1999, the German mark was still the king in Europe. And we made the German mark legal tender, and we got rid of the hyperinflating Yugoslav dinar. So that would be called dollarization. Or in some place like Liechtenstein is dollarized because Liechtenstein uses the Swiss franc. It's using a foreign currency. Now one thing that we haven't talked about is that either dollarization, pure dollarization, or a currency board, which is clone dollarization, shall we say? Let's call it the real thing is dollarization. The clone is a currency board. They're both technically the same. They operate in the same way. You have a exchange rate policy. You have no monetary policy. I've studied all these countries that had either dollarization or currency board since 1953, and I've compared them to other emerging market countries, comparable countries, Klaus, where you have some form of floating. None of them have pure floating, but they have what they call managed exchange rates in some cases. So those are kind of quasi-floating, not free, but more or less kind of free. Yeah. And in all those countries, compared to dollarization and currency boards, here's the key thing, coming back to what Sarkis was talking about. For dollarized or currency board countries, the growth rate's higher, the inflation is lower, the fiscal deficits are much lower, the debt to GDP ratios are a lot lower, and banking crises are very rare, or shall we say runs on the banks or runs on the currency in a country. Those things you don't find in currency board or dollarized countries. They're just superior. Empirically, if you let the data talk, Klaus, it's unambiguous that these systems are superior. So the question is, well, why don't they do them?
This relates to another question that I had to both Dr. Corey and Dr. Hankey. And because there's often a lot of discussion of sequencing of reforms. And we know, for example, that in Lebanon, we have a currency crisis, we have a public debt crisis, we have unemployment at 25%, no electricity or problems with electricity supply, etc. So why is it so crucial to very quickly and as a first key reform measure address the currency issue and the dollarization, rather than say, well, first we should get the public deficit under control, first we should get the banking sector under control, then we can dollarize. Some people would say that. What is wrong with that argument?
If I may,
Dr. Corey.
Yeah, just the environmental factors that led to the dollar being such a huge currency in Lebanon. In the 1960s, Steve, that we had about 25% of the country was dollarized. In other words, most of the accounts in the banks and people using the currency as a medium of exchange. In the 1970s, it became like almost 50%. In the 1990s, it was almost 75%. To be exact, it was about 70%. And right now is almost 90%. I was in Lebanon last month. I wanted to spend money. Anybody that was selling me anything, please pay us in dollars if you can. And if I want to pay them in the official exchange rate, exchange rate, which is right now 3,800 at the time at least, last month, they would accept it. But why would I pay them at 3,800 if the black market rate is 7,000? So I could, it just didn't make any sense. Therefore, they prefer to receive the dollar.
Whether it's a dollarization or clone dollarization as a currency board, the devil is often in the detail when it comes to reforms. So I want to ask you, and as well as Dr. Corey, is how do we pick the exchange rate? The new exchange rate, because it's a crucial issue for income distribution, for competitiveness of Lebanese industry once you have entered into the dollarization, and there is no way back. You cannot change the exchange rate afterwards if you think you made a mistake. So how do we pick a new exchange rate between
I'll tell you how
permanent exchange rate?
I'll tell you how I've done this, and I've written about this extensively, but I actually did it in Bulgaria. So with either dollarization or the currency board, you're right. You have to pick an exchange rate. What's the exchange rate going to be? So my preferred solution, and the one I did in Bulgaria, is you announce that you're going to dollarize or put in a currency board. In Bulgaria in July of 1997, we put in a currency board. And I was President Stoyanov's advisor and designed the thing and put it in. So we announced that we were going to institute a currency board. And then we also said we are freezing the monetary base. The money supply is going to be frozen for 30 days, and we will let the exchange rate freely float with no restrictions or anything. We will observe the movement in the exchange rate, and of course at the end of 30 days you'll also have an exchange rate on that 30th day. You look at all these exchange rates, the pattern, the volume of trading and so forth, and then you use that information, Klaus, to make a judgment about where you should fix the rate, because you let the market basically determine what the rate is going to be. If you did that, and you can make some bench calculations, some economists could see if this makes sense and works and so forth. It worked perfectly. There was absolutely no problem, and that's what I would do. Now let me give you a dollarized case where they did it wrong, and that was Ecuador, which I wasn't involved when President Malwood announced that he was going to dollarize the country. He said we're going to dollarize it at 25,000 sucre to the dollar. Well, that was he put a huge devaluation into the calculation. It was just an arbitrary number. He just grabbed it out of the air. The sucre had collapsed. It was already trading at 20,000. Then he said, "Oh, we're going to fix the rate at 25,000." So he did a maxi devaluation on top of a maxi devaluation. Now, what happened? Everything was fine. Everything stabilized and so forth, but the inflation rate stayed elevated relative to the United States for a couple of years. It took a couple of years to get the inflation rate down to the U.S. level. If he would have done the rate at a proper level, let's say maybe 15,000, the inflation rate would have come down to the U.S. level right away. Lebanon has a currency crisis. Most people are confused and don't realize if you have a currency crisis, if you have a raging inferno, you go in and put out the raging fire in the inferno first. You must stabilize the exchange rate and the currency situation and kill hyperinflation immediately. That does one key thing. It gives the government who does it credibility, so they can then go into all these other problems that exist. The banks, the electricity, the subsidies, all these other things. And Lebanon is a complete disaster with all these other policies. But you will never be able to do anything unless you stabilize the exchange and get rid of inflation, because no politician will have credibility. They will not be able to do anything. The electricity has been a problem ever since the Civil War. They never had electricity because the politicians have no credibility. Plus they're
Steve, when we did the currency grid, when the euro came into being, all the rates were pegged against basically each other. There was a currency grid, and this was done pretty much at the time, if I remember correctly, administratively. Similarly, when Slovakia joined the European Monetary Union, the rate was kind of figured out semi-administratively. Is it possible, for example, the three of us could figure out what is the appropriate rate for the Lebanese government to use in the transition period between the peg and dollarization?
If you wanted to get the three of us involved, you'd have a committee of 5, the three of us plus 2 Lebanese. And what we would do, we need market information. We do not need administrative numbers or bench calculations. We need to let this thing float for 30 days like we did in Bulgaria. Then the committee of experts would decide what the appropriate rate would be. But the transition and so forth in a place like Lebanon, there was no place in Europe where they were having, in the middle of a currency crisis, when they set the grid for the euro, everything was pretty calm, you know. It was fairly easy to do.
We all know that the currency right now is floating in the black market. We know that right now in Lebanon. At this point here, we do have a reference price, so to speak, alternative to the government price. The government says 1,500, then it became 3,800, depending on which transaction you're doing. But the black market, as you know, that's covered extensively in my book, by the way. The black market is about between 7,000 and 10,000, depending on which area in Lebanon you are exchanging money. So my question to you here is, there is some kind of a reference price in the black market. Will that be some kind of a guidance as to, number one, whether dollarization should be done and at what price?
The black market is a free market now, but there's an institution stuck in the picture, and that's a central bank. So it is a free market price, given the fact that the central bank still exists. It has discretionary monetary policy, et cetera, et cetera. What we want to do is announce we are going to dollarize, or we are going to put in a currency board, and we will let the free market float for 30 days before we do the fix. But in the meantime, we are freezing the high-powered money supply. We're taking the central bank out of the picture. You've got to get the central bank out of the picture to get a true price. My guess is, by the way, that the Lebanese pound, if you did that, this is a guess, but my guess is the Lebanese pound would appreciate considerably over where it is now. Now, the black market, I looked this morning at 7,100. I mean, as you say, it varies depending on where you're trading and so forth. It's around, as you said before, around 7,000. I think it would appreciate considerably if you use this announcement that the central bank was going to be essentially put in a straitjacket and put off to the side.
Well, that's the idea of dollarization, is to put the central bank into a straitjacket forever as far as the currency is concerned. The IMF right now is saying that they were suggesting floating the currency. What do you think will happen if they did that?
The currency will perhaps temporarily stabilize but sink. It could do exactly what I think. Look, in July 1997 in Indonesia, the IMF came in with a program, and Indonesia, we had, remember, the Asian financial crisis started in Thailand in the summer of 1997. And as a result, there were all kinds of ricochet effects and going on. And Indonesia and the rupiah became very much pressurized. They had a peg. They had a peg like Lebanon. It became under a lot of pressure. So the IMF said, "Oh, float. You got to float." Well, the rupiah sunk like a stone, and it set off a huge inflation, food riots, et cetera, and finally I was called in January of 1998 because Suharto got so fed up with the IMF's advice. So
I got it.
I think that scenario is possible in Lebanon.
I have two more quick questions. We also have to move on to our third guest. Just one question with brief answers, please. And one is dollarization. To what extent is formal or informal approval from U.S. government or Federal Reserve required?
It's not needed at all. We got no approval at all in Ecuador and El Salvador, no approval. When we did the dollarization in Montenegro and accepted the Deutschmark, we did inform the Bundesbank, and the Bundesbank, Montenegro is exactly like Lebanon that Sarkis is talking about. It had already spontaneously dollarized. The Deutschmark was the big currency in Montenegro. For all big transactions, you had to use the Deutschmark. Just like Lebanon, any big transaction, you got to use the dollar. So the problem we had was that there wasn't small change. There weren't small denomination Deutschmark bills and change. So the Bundesbank did send an armored truck down to Montenegro with some small denominated bills so that you could buy candy bars and things like that.
We need to go on to our third guest, Dr. Chartouni, who is waiting in Lebanon, I believe, right?
As a final comment, if I may, Steve, this is yes or no. You are not by any means suggesting that Lebanon is in a position right now to allow the currency to float as an alternative to dollarization. Your final comment.
I think it would be a disaster if they floated.
I agree totally. Now, regarding the transition period, the Federal Reserve at one time, the Federal Reserve, will have to coordinate with the Lebanese Central Bank in terms of currencies, dollars coming to Lebanon, different denomination, and so on and so forth. And they want to make sure that there is no hanky-panky involved in any of the Lebanese banks, as has usually been the case. Would that be some kind of an arrangement that the Lebanese bank will be properly monitored by the central bank, and then whatever the Lebanese central bank needs can be, it's their responsibility to borrow it in the market. In other words, the Federal Reserve is not going to say, this is billions of dollars, do whatever you want with it, right? They're going to be ultimately the responsibility of Lebanese banks and the central bank to deal with the Federal Reserve Bank. True or false?
I don't think that's necessary. That's not my experience. That's not what we've done in any of these cases. There's been, shall we say, a notification that they plan to do this, but they asked for no approval. The Federal Reserve doesn't regulate anything.
So basically, in dollarization, Steve, as a final point, if I may, in dollarization, all that needs to happen is for the Lebanese government to recognize that the current system is not working, and we have, as a government, decided to dollarize, and that will put everything in motion. True or false?
Yes, that's true.
Okay. I have read suggestions or proposals for Lebanon to adopt the Bitcoin as its new currency. What do you think about that, Dr. Hanke?
Well, No, number one, the Bitcoin is not a currency. It's not a stable unit of account. To be a currency, you have to have some sort of stable unit of account to measure. You have to have basically a yardstick, a ruler that isn't fluctuating around in length. And a Bitcoin is a speculative asset that it would be a complete disaster and foolishness. The idea of doing this is just insane, almost.
I will go even
Bitcoin,
further, Steve. I will go
Pardon?
even further. I think the Bitcoin itself is a problem, and it never had an anchor. It never really had a value. It was never used for transaction purposes by the average guy anywhere, and I think it will be a disaster.
It would be a disaster. Plus, there's enough criminality in Lebanon already. This would even foster more criminality. I mean, this is a medium of exchange that's used mainly by criminals.
Yes. Steve, I know that you and I and Klaus at one time offered our services for free for the Lebanese government. All they have to do is host us in there, and we'll be happy to help them any way we can. And we clearly have not received any reaction yet. I also want to note that you wrote a book on Lebanon that was translated to Arabic. And is it available for circulated in Lebanon now?
It's at the Center for Market Studies in Tripoli. If you look at their website, it's free, and anyone can just go to the website and the book is there. Or you can go to my Johns Hopkins University website, and many of my currency board books are available at the Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health, and the Study of Business Enterprise, or just email me at hanky@jhu.edu, and I'll send you the links to. These are in English. These are in English, but the Arabic translation, it's a good translation, and it's available in Tripoli.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hanke.
Thank you.
I am very pleased that there is so much agreement here between Dr. Hanke and Dr. Corey about the way forward. And Dr. Hanke has a lot of experience and expresses a lot of optimism again and the possible speed of this type of reform and its success. So I want to thank you both for these insights and hope it will contribute in a very positive way to the political discussion and economic discussion in Lebanon. We have a final guest, Dr. Chartouni in Lebanon. He's a former professor of political science at the Lebanese University, and we wanted to ask him a little bit more about what's the political situation right now. There is a new prime minister designate, and President Macron from France has been helping negotiate a possible way forward with the reforms, and President Macron is still there, I believe, in Lebanon. So my question is essentially is what is the political situation truly, and what are the prospects for substantial reform? And also, if you have a view on it, what is the prospect for the reforms proposed here by Dr. Corey and Dr. Hanke?
Thank you, Steve. We have to leave you right now. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. The three of us have to get unlocked and go to Beirut.
We have Dr. Charles Chartouni. Let me just briefly introduce you as formerly a professor of political science at Lebanese University and a writer and TV guest in many shows in Lebanon in particular. We know that you have a great overview of the situation and the history of Lebanon and the Lebanese tragedy that's been unfolding for fairly long now. And as world citizens, we are all concerned about Lebanon and its future. I know that just yesterday a new prime minister was designated, and I know that that President Macron from France is right now in Lebanon and discussing possible solutions to the crisis. So what I want to ask you to do is to give us a brief summary of your hopes and prospects for these meetings that are now going on, and whether the new government that is being formed, does it have a chance to resolve the situation?
Thank you, Professor Wilburn, for the question. I should start explaining the situation by tracing the actual developments to the explosion that took place 3 weeks ago, and which had devastating impact, be it on an urban scale, be it on a human scale, be it on a political scale, be it on an economic scale. It was devastating from every single perspective you can imagine. And therefore, it has demonstrated how bad the situation in Lebanon and almost irreparable the situation is in Lebanon. This what has induced, the French president to come in less than a month twice, because he was very much afraid that the situation is on a slippery slope, whereby, the Lebanon is going to become the next platform of regional and international proxy wars in the Middle East, which means he was obviously interested in dealing with the situation in Lebanon, but at the same time, he was very much worried about the spillover effects of the events in Lebanon on the whole situation in the Middle East. And this is what made me make this statement, the following statement, that the actual Lebanese crisis, is the second stage of the implosion of the Middle East, which means by failing to address the Lebanese problem, by failing to contain, the spillover effects of the Lebanese crisis, we are going to end up in a larger political crisis that is going to spill over the rest of the Middle East. This is the situation, if I want to sum it up. Now, whenever it comes to the formation of the actual cabinet, I'm very skeptical. This cabinet was formed, the nomination of the designated prime minister was done by the oligarchs, and the oligarchs are still interested and still managing their private interests, their factional interests, their sectarian interests, and they are not here neither to address the true problems nor to respond, to the majority of people who have been demonstrating for the last 8 months against, this monumental mismanagement and monumental robbery that you have been accounting for and that you have been explaining in your program, just before my own intervention. So therefore, I don't think that these people are interested. I don't think that these people have understood what has happened, not only starting the 17th of October 2019, but even the tragic events which have unfolded right after the 4th of August. None of the lessons were taken by these people. They are still adamant about the oligarchic foreclosures. They are very much adamant about managing their interests, and they are overlooking, the basic interests and rights of the Lebanese people at large. And this is what is driving a very dangerous course of event, which is the massive departure of the youth, the massive departure of those who have been opposing those oligarchs, and the massive departure of Christian families leaving by droves, And I'm very, very, very pessimistic at the very wake, because today we are celebrating the centennial of the birth of the Lebanese Republic, and we are at the same time, making our mourning on this republic. I think the Republic of Lebanon is dead.
Well, that's a vivid and unfortunately pessimistic picture you are painting here. Dr. Coy, do you want to comment at all on this?
Yeah, I would like to ask a question. What can Macron's visit, how can it transform the outlook, the political outlook in Lebanon?
My guess, the most important outcome of Emmanuel Macron's visit to Lebanon is the following. Macron has prevented us from being isolated from the international community, because this is what the Hezbollah has been striving for, is to isolate us from the rest of the international community and from the rest of the Arab community. They were trying to set political and ideological and financial and economic foreclosures in order to cut the ties of Lebanon from the rest of the world. They have been challenging the Bretton Woods rules. They have been challenging, our, historical relationship with the West. They have been challenging our relationships with the rest of the Arab world, and they want us to be cowed to their own political and geostrategic agenda. And therefore, this is something that is taken into account by the French presidency, and therefore the French presidency is very much alert on what's happening, and they are willing to mediate, try to broker a middle-of-the-road solution, but I think the chances are very scarce, for one simple reason that, Hezbollah's agenda is tied to Iran's agenda, the mullah's agenda, and the big problem is the following. The mullah's agenda is very simple. They are unwilling to normalize by international standards for one simple reason, that normalization is going to drive liberalization, and neither normalization nor liberalization are part of the ideological point of view or part of the vested interests of the nomenclatura and the religious nomenclatura that is in control of Iran.
Charles, if I may interrupt you for a second. Charles, how about the reconstruction effort? Can the French be like the focus point for all the reconstruction of Lebanon? And how is there any reconstruction taking place? Because I know a lot of people lost homes and buildings and whatever, and some people are even going hungry. Is there any hope for that the reconstruction will be in full force anytime soon?
Joe, let me tell you one thing. We are at the stage of basic, relief, basic assistance. We have not yet reached the stage whereby, a concrete, a tangible, and a systematic effort at reconstruction is at hand. I was, as a matter of fact, asking a friend of mine who is an urban architect on the situation in eastern Beirut, next to the port where the explosion has taken place, whether something has started from an architectural and from an engineering, and structural engineering point of view. He said so far nothing. All what has been done so far is clearing the rubble, is making the survey, identifying, the fragile buildings, etc., etc. But so far nothing tangible has translated into systematic efforts. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, and this is the most critical aspect. The most critical aspect is that the government has totally overlooked the situation. It has not offered any assistance under whichever consideration, neither financial, nor technical, nor logistical, or what has been done so far was carried out by civil society actors, by European actors, by American actors, by foreign NGOs, etc., etc., etc.
Dr. Chartouni, I'm afraid we are running out of time here. It's very interesting to hear your points of view. As an outsider from the Lebanese position, I'm feel somewhat discouraged by what you're saying. But we have to finish, and I want to thank you very much for contributing to the discussion here. And finally,
you, Dr.
we wish you the best.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening and watching this show, The Conservative Edge. It's been a pleasure for me to sit in as a guest host. And I want to thank the guests, the general host of the show, Dr. Corey, Dr. Hankey, and Dr. Chartouni in Lebanon. Thank you very much for watching.